The year I turned 26, my own mother told me to stop being her problem. My husband had been dead 11 days. I stood on her porch with two 1-year-olds asleep in the back of the car, asking for 3 weeks and a couch. She looked at me the way you look at a bill you didn't expect. I want you to hold her face in your mind. Because 8 years later, that same face would freeze on my land in front of 300 people waiting for a check that was never coming. This begins in the cold. It ends with $100 million and a single sentence that emptied a room. Daniel died on a Tuesday in October, pinned under a tractor on a slope he'd graded 100 times. He was 28. I was 26. Our twins, Caleb and Hannah, had just learned to clap. The hospital called at 4:11 in the afternoon. I remember the time because I was warming bottles, and the microwave still had 11 seconds on the clock when I picked up. I drove 40 minutes with my hands at 10 and 2, and my mind perfectly, terribly blank. I signed 3 forms and my signature came out steady, which felt like a betrayal of its own. That night I sat on the kitchen floor between 2 cribs and did the math out loud. Rent, daycare, the truck payment, diapers in 2 sizes. I counted it twice and got the same answer both times. Which was no, so I drove to my parents' brick house with the seasonal wreath and I knocked. My mother Linda opened the door in her good cardigan and did not step aside. My father Gary hovered in the hall and looked at his shoes. My brother Travis cracked his bedroom door, saw it was me, and shut it again. My mother folded her arms and told me the family was stretched thin, that 2 babies was a lot to take on, that adults handle their own messes. Then she said the thing I would carry for 8 years. We can't be your safety net, Bethany. I carried 2 car seats back down the steps while she watched from behind the screen door. And somewhere between the second step and the truck, the porch light clicked off like even the house was done with me. I didn't cry until the county line. Then I called the only other number I had. Ruth Sinclair, Daniel's mother. I only meant to tell her I was struggling. I didn't ask for a thing because asking had just cost me the last of something I couldn't name. Ruth listened for maybe 20 seconds. Then she said, "Where are you right now?" I told her the gas station off Route 9. She said, "Don't move." 40 minutes later, Walt Sinclair's truck pulled in beside mine. The old man got out without a word and started transferring car seats like he'd done it 1,000 times. Ruth came around the passenger side, carrying a blue quilt stitched with white stars, the one she'd made when the twins were born. And she wrapped Caleb, and then Hannah in it right there under the fluorescent lights. Then she pressed something warm into my hands. A chipped casserole dish the color of a marigold, foil over the top, still hot, like she'd grabbed it straight off the stove. I started to say I couldn't. Ruth cut me off the way only a kind woman can, gently and completely. She looked at Walt and said, "Set 2 more plates." They're ours now. 7 words in a gas station parking lot. I followed their tail lights 40 miles out to Cedar Hollow, Texas. And I didn't know it yet, but I'd just met my real family for the first time. Here's the part nobody at my mother's house ever bothered to learn about me. I had a degree in equine science, earned over 6 years of night classes and double shifts at a vet clinic, paid for entirely by myself. I knew bloodlines. I knew confirmation. I knew the difference between a horse that was sound and one that just hadn't broken down yet. On day 9, Walt walked me out to see the stock. I stopped cold at a stall in the back. A bay mare, 4 years old, with a left front leg that turned in slightly at the knee. Walt said she was going to Saturday's sale. Nobody wanted a crooked-legged mare. He couldn't afford to feed what he couldn't sell. Everyone who'd looked at her had seen a cull. I watched her move 3 steps across the straw and saw something else entirely. That turned-in leg let her load and push off a fraction faster than any straight-legged horse ever could. I asked Walt to give me until spring. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Then he looked at the mare, then he nodded. Her name was Juniper. She was the first thing I'd chosen in 11 days. I took every odd job within driving distance. Broke colts at dawn, drove a feed route midday, mucked stalls and read genetics papers until my eyes crossed. The bank had given the Sinclairs 18 months before the foreclosure conversation. I knew that number like my own pulse. It took 14 months to bring Juniper along. I didn't fight that leg. I built around it, conditioning her to use what she had. By the following spring, she could stop on a dime and roll back faster than horses worth, 10 times what she'd have brought at that Saturday sale. I entered her in a small reigning futurity 2 counties over, folding chairs, a hot dog stand, 41 horses. Juniper drew early. When she ran her pattern, that turned-in leg sank her into the ground on her stops like she was pouring herself into it. We placed third. I stood in the dirt, holding a green ribbon worth maybe nothing, and I felt the first solid thing under my feet in over a year. An older woman in the bleachers had been writing in a leather notebook the whole time. When Juniper made her final stop, the woman stopped writing and just watched. Afterward, she found me at the trailer and asked one question. "Where did you get that mare's bloodline?" I told her I'd built it from a horse headed to slaughter. She handed me a card and said she'd be in touch. The card said Vivian Hargrove. I had no idea who she was. I was about to find out, and it would change the size of everything I thought I was allowed to want. My parents called twice, a year like clockwork. That Christmas, my mother spent 3 minutes on Travis, his fitness franchise, how it was going to be huge, how proud they were. Then she remembered I was on the line. I told her I'd placed a horse at a futurity. She said, "Well, that's nice." Then she asked how the babies were doing. My children were almost 2. And my own mother called them the babies because she had never once asked their names. I said, "Caleb and Hannah," like a correction. She said, of course, and then Travis needs the phone, happy holidays, and the line went dead. I hung up and went to set the table. I added 2 extra plates without being asked, because in that house, that was just what you did. Vivian Hargrove was not a nice older lady who liked horses. She was 40 years in performance breeding, a reputation that opened gates from Texas to Kentucky. She came to the Sinclair place that February, walked the fence line with Walt, then asked to see Juniper move. She watched 10 full minutes without speaking. Then she turned to me. "You read that leg correctly," which most people with letters after their name would have missed. "I want to know what else you can see." I told her Juniper's line could throw a whole generation of horses that moved the way she did, that the trait was heritable, that the market would pay for it if I could prove it across foals. Vivian asked how much capital it would take to find out. I gave her the figure without flinching. She said, "Let me invest in you." My first instinct was no. I'd learned what people meant when they offered to help. I'd learned it on a porch in October, so I didn't say yes. I said I'd need to see the terms in writing, every line of them. Vivian smiled like I'd just passed a test. I hired a lawyer named Pat who charged me in installments and earned every dollar. We spent 3 weeks on the agreement. Vivian would fund the breeding program and hold a minority stake with a clean buyout path. But the part I dug in on, the part Pat said most people in my position never think to protect, was the bloodline itself. The genetics, the breeding rights, the records, the future of Juniper's line, all structured separately, entirely under my control. Vivian read my red lines, looked up over her glasses, and said, "You're going to do just fine, aren't you?" I learned something young that I've never had to unlearn. The people who love you sign clearly. The people who use you sign in fog. Vivian signed clearly in blue ink on a Tuesday. And when Pat slid the executed copies into a folder, I felt a click somewhere in my chest. The sound of a foundation setting. The first Juniper foal hit the ground in spring. A leggy bay colt who stood up wrong and then moved right. I knew within a week he had it. We bred carefully, 3 mares the first year, then 6. The money started slow and then not slow. We fixed the barn roof. We paid the bank ahead of schedule. And the foreclosure conversation that had lived in my chest like a second heartbeat simply stopped. Word spread past the county, then past the state. And somewhere 90 minutes east, a phone started ringing in the other direction. My mother called on an ordinary Thursday in March, which is how I knew immediately something had changed. Her voice was warmer, rounded at the edges. She used the program's name correctly, which meant she'd heard it somewhere, which meant it had traveled. She asked about Caleb and Hannah by name. The names came out half a second slow, like she'd practiced them in the driveway before calling. I stood in the tack room holding the phone and felt the strangest thing. Not warmth, not relief. A cold, clean alertness, the kind you get when a horse you trust suddenly pins its ears. I'd find out why a month later, when Travis forwarded me an email by mistake. Underneath the new message sat an entire thread going back 6 years. A conversation between my mother, my father, and my brother from the spring after Daniel died. My mother had written that taking me in would have been throwing good money after bad, that I'd made my choices marrying a dirt-poor rancher, that some people are just a bad investment. My father had agreed, adding they had to think about Travis's future. And then the line that hollowed me out and refilled me with something harder: we keep it civil. We don't burn the bridge completely. If the ranch ever amounts to something, we'll want the door cracked. They hadn't forgotten me out of carelessness. They'd filed me away on purpose. An asset marked down, held in case it appreciated. The warm phone calls weren't a thaw. They were a quarterly review. I printed the email, not for a lawyer, not for a lawsuit. So I would never again confuse what they were doing with love. I didn't plot some elaborate revenge. I'm not built for schemes. What I did instead was simpler, and I think harder. I decided I would not give them a single hour of my anger. I would build something so solid, so completely mine, that when the day came they reached for it, their hands would close on air. Build. Structure, wait. The offer came when the twins were 9. A Western lifestyle company, competitions, clothing, streaming had been circling for a year. Their people sat across from me and pat at my kitchen table and slid a number across the wood. $100 million. For the land, the facility, the brand, and they were very clear, the genetics and the breeding rights. I asked for 2 weeks. That night, I leaned on Juniper's paddock rail and already knew I'd take it. The only question left was who I'd open the door for. I built the allocation before I finished signing. 3 structures, airtight with Pat. An irrevocable trust for Caleb and Hannah, locked so tightly no charm, no lawsuit, no tearful plea could ever pry a dollar loose. A deed to the original 80 acres signed back to Walt and Ruth, free and clear, theirs forever, plus a funded account to carry them for the rest of their lives. When I told Ruth, she put down the dish towel and said, "You don't owe us a thing, honey." I said, "I know." That's exactly why. And a foundation, the Daniel Sinclair Memorial Scholarship, funded for the long haul. For young people entering equine science, with a preference written right into the bylaws for applicants raising children alone. I wrote that line myself. I made Pat read it back to me twice. Every meaningful dollar allocated to the people who had shown up. Signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed before the celebration date. There would be nothing left to negotiate when the day came. They showed up anyway. The morning of the event, close to 300 people drifted across the grounds. Walt and Ruth sat in the front row with the twins on either side. Vivian squeezed my arm and said, "You did exactly what I knew you'd do." Ruth had brought her stew in that same chipped marigold dish. And as I stepped toward the stage, I scanned the crowd one last time. That's when I saw them. My mother, my father, and Travis walking through the front gate uninvited, dressed for a photograph, working the edges of the crowd like they own the day. My mother stopped to introduce herself to strangers as Beth's mother. You must be so impressed. We always knew. Travis positioned himself near the press cameras and told a reporter loudly that the family had sacrificed everything to give me my start. That this was a story about what a family can do when they stand together. My father trailed behind, hands in pockets, eyes finding mine and sliding away. My mother caught my eye across the crowd and lifted her hand in a small wave. Confident, proprietary. The wave of a woman certain her seat was being saved. I climbed the steps onto the stage, set my unneeded pages on the podium, found Ruth's eyes in the front row, and then I began. I didn't raise my voice. That was the whole point. The louder a thing is, the easier it is to argue with. So I started soft, and the crowd leaned in, and by the time I reached the part that mattered, 300 people were dead silent, straining toward every word. I told them the short version of the truth. That 8 years ago, I'd arrived in Cedar Hollow with 2 babies and nothing. That the people who'd taken me in hadn't asked what I could do for them. They'd just set 2 more plates. Then I gave the first gift, the Daniel Sinclair Memorial Scholarship, and my husband's name unfurled 20 feet tall on the banner behind me. The crowd made that warm, low sound a crowd makes when something lands. Then I asked Walt and Ruth to stand, and I told 300 people that the deed to this land was already, as of that week, signed back to them. Free and clear, theirs forever. Because 8 years ago they'd given a stranger a home, and you don't repay that, you can only try to match it. Ruth started to cry. Walt caught her elbow. The crowd rose, and the applause rolled across the grounds like weather. I let it settle. Then I looked directly at the 3 faces in the crowd that had not moved. And I said the only thing left to say, quietly, so the whole silent crowd could hear every word. Family isn't who shares your blood, it's who showed up. My mother found her voice first. The porch voice, 8 years older and twice as sharp. "How dare you," she said, loud enough that heads turned. "How dare you humiliate your family in front of all these people?" Travis stepped forward, saying something about how this wasn't legal, that family had rights, that they'd contributed. Words with no weight because there were no documents behind them. Only a story they'd told in public, and a structure I'd built in private that they couldn't touch. The buyer's staff moved toward them with the gentle, immovable politeness of people who do this for a living. My father didn't say a word. He just looked at me, and for one last second I saw the confession flicker across his face, the thing he felt and would never do. Then he looked at the ground and let himself be guided toward the gate. My mother kept talking the whole way out, her voice getting smaller as the distance grew. "After everything I did for you, after everything," until the gate closed and the words stopped and the grounds were just my people again. The celebration went on, the way celebrations do. But I slipped away for a minute, sat on the porch swing, and Ruth came and sat beside me without a word. Somebody had left the blue star quilt folded over the arm of the swing, soft and faded now, 8 years of washings thin in the cotton. Ruth pulled it across both our laps. Out past the rail, Juniper grazed in the gold evening light. Beside her, June, her last foal, a bright bay filly with one white sock and a knee that turned in just slightly, exactly like her dam. Caleb and Hannah came running across the grass and piled onto the swing and under the quilt. 4 of us tangled up in a faded blanket that had once wrapped 2 babies in a parking lot when we had nothing. We didn't have nothing anymore, but that was never really the point. My family hired a lawyer. The letter arrived full of words like asterisk reasonable expectation asterisk and family contribution. Pat read it once, set it down, and said it had all the legal force of a wish. There was nothing to contest. I hadn't built a scheme they could break. I'd built a structure they could only stand outside of. The foundation gave out its first scholarship, that fall to a 24-year-old widow with a toddler working nights who wanted to study equine science and had been told by everyone in her life that it wasn't practical for a girl in her situation. I read her essay 3 times. I called Pat and told her to make sure that one went through. Because 8 years ago, a woman knocked on the wrong door with 2 babies and got told she was a bad investment. I just wanted to be the right door for somebody else. I kept a smaller place after the sale, 20 acres down the road from Walt and Ruth, with a barn just big enough for what matters. Juniper still grazes by the live oak where the kids can see her from the fence. We eat dinner at a table with no empty seats and no hidden ledgers. Most nights it's nothing special. Just stew and homework and a dog under the table. And that ordinary, unremarkable piece is the richest thing I own. It cost me $100 million to learn it was free all along. 1 closed door, 1 open kitchen, and a crooked-legged horse nobody wanted but me. If somebody showed up for you when your own blood wouldn't, go tell them today. Don't wait for $100 million reason. Drop a comment. Tell me about the door that opened for you. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.